A revolution is called a force. Earthquakes, plagues, floods, all are forces of nature. However, no one praises them. They are not canonized. They are resisted. What makes a revolution? Vanity. What puts an end to it? Also vanity. And freedom for all was a wonderful excuse to fool the crowds. Ivan Bunin, Cursed Days. Revolutions do not create a nation, they destroy it. Several years after the events on Maidan, many discovered this truth. But looking back, we often ask ourselves, could the recent history of Ukraine have played out differently? What force brought together half of its population to chant in unison the mantras of the leaders of the Orange Revolution in anticipation of an instant Ukrainian miracle? Could a country that jealously guards its independence avoid the Maidan? What triggered the events of 2004? A surge of national consciousness or a craftily carried out manipulation of consciousness? Newspaper 2000, Ukraine, presents a documentary public film based on its journalistic investigation of what was printed in the news and in several analytical books. This movie will provide you with a fresh view of the oranges of the Orange Revolution, the tragic fate of Ukrainian journalist Georgy Gongadze, and the people involved in the massive political gamble. The outcome of the Orange Revolution was accurately foretold by journalists and authors of Newspaper 2000 long before the actual events took place. Roy Medvedev, historian and journalist. It turned out to be a practical scene. There was no need for weapons, no need for an armed uprising. Just bring the masses out into the streets. And this is happening today in Lebanon, when hundreds of thousands of people, under the flags of one or another party, go outside to overthrow either an anti-Syrian or a pro-Syrian government. In addition, it all begins with the murder of a popular politician. Vladimir Kornilov, director of the Institute of CIS Countries, Ukraine. Seeing how events in Yugoslavia, Georgia, and Ukraine developed identically, the conclusion can be reached that the instigators were the same. The sponsors were the same. You can combine these three into one question. Who benefited from it? Who profited?
Кому в итоге от этого стало лучше? Кому стало выгодней?
A game of Americana, a pool game. The game of Americana. The purpose of this game is to be the first to sink the 8 balls. The first break is made from the kitchen. There is no need to declare anything. No rules apply. I am certain that now, as of autumn 2001, in Ukraine it became clear to all that for almost a year, some forces have been slowly trying to execute a coup d'état in the country. In order to implement, a covert operation has been developed and conducted. Sergei Kichagin, the Newspaper 2000. Sergei Kichagin, Editor-in-Chief of 2000, Ukraine. We were dealing with a very complex, multi-layered situation. Starting with a covert action against Kuchma, there was involvement in the situation by Western intelligence agencies and Western political institutions, and Russia, and various vested interests from numerous groups of financial oligarchs. Sergei Lozunko, 2000, columnist, Ukraine. Berezovsky did not provide money for a revolution or a coup. He provided to support democracy and freedom of speech and so on. But in reality, it financed a coup. All of those Western foundations that provided grants. It was all funding for this revolution.
Плюс еще, что объединяет все эти три революции, цветные так называемые, это...
What else unites all of the colored revolutions? The calcification of authority and power. a complete disregard for warning signs, a complete ignorance of indicators that such sentiments could eventually lead to riots, and blockaded roads and streets.
Подобные брожения в итоге могут вылиться в уличные беспорядки, блокирование дорог и улиц.
A special operation was launched on June 25, 2000. On this day in Odessa, in the Cafe Pearl, in the 10th area of the Great Fountain District, there was a shooting. One person died and 9 were taken to intensive care. Shortly before, 2 men visited the cafe and introduced themselves as reporters from Kiev. One showed an ID and the name of Georgy Gongadze. They spoke with the cafe owner for 15 minutes. The conversation was heated. Immediately after their departure from the cafe, a few men from the Caucasus arrived and opened fire. That is, someone was impersonating Gongadze. This individual appeared and disappeared. There was talk that somebody was trying to provoke Gongadze and attempting to discredit him. We strongly believe that this was done to put police on his tail, to set up shadowing. He was being followed. Larissa Skort, deputy of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine from 1991-94. This story began here in Odessa in order to create this image of Guy, nicknamed for Georgy, as a persecuted person. For this, Guy was a perfect candidate in all respects. He was a man who was known abroad. He spoke a foreign language. He was from another country, from Georgia. This half Ukrainian, half Georgian was open, charming, and very witty. Incidentally, just before the incident in Odessa, Georgy Gongadze visited the US with a letter about violations of freedom of speech in Ukraine. From that point, any reprisals against him could create a massive fury and produce a public image of a fighter battling a crooked regime.
Где-то через пару лет после его гибели мы решили.
A few years after his death, we decided to publish in our newspaper all of his articles in order to determine what kind of individual he was. Be it 20, 30, or 50 articles, we published them all so that people would have factual documentation in their hands.
Мы все напечатаем, чтобы люди имели документ в руках. Я дал задание нашему секретариату.
I assigned staff to collect all his work for publication. Sometime later, they brought me a few articles by Gongadze that were fairly short and rather neutral in content. There were 6 or 7 articles in total, not a single word of criticism of Kuchma.
В которых не было ни одного слова критики в адрес Кучмы.
Geya Gongadze. Until autumn 2000, few knew that name. A native of Tbilisi, he was educated at Lvov University. He had all the requisites for a successful career: good looks, an analytical mind, vanity, and ambition. By the time he was 25, he had been through a tough school of life. When the civil war began in Georgia, and Ruslan Gongadze, Guy's father, who headed the Georgian Radical Union, was declared an enemy of the state, Georgy went to his homeland to defend his father's honor. In 1993, he was wounded in Sukhumi and returned to Lvov. In 1995, he set off to conquer the capital of Ukraine. He worked as a TV announcer and tried to hand in political analysis. In April 2000, he unexpectedly established and led the online opposition newspaper Ukrainska Pravda.
И вот этот 2000
2000 was the year when this horrendous and immoral disappearance of Geya was contrived. I will not say it was a murder, because I think at that point he had not been murdered. I'm sure of that. It was not then that he was killed, even if it was said so. And the murder of Gongadze, that was carried out much earlier, cannot be directly tied to the Orange Revolution in 2004. That is, the murder of Gongadze was carried out in the anticipation that it would cause the removal of President Kuchma from his post at that time, several months after the murder.